27 children, one teacher, and a silence that lasted nearly a decade. At a quiet Catholic boarding school in Vermont, Sister Miriam vanished overnight, along with an entire class. The school denied she ever existed. Parents were told to forget, but years later, a former student stumbled upon a single letter that would unravel everything. What really happened beneath St. Agnes? And why was the truth buried for so long? It was the kind of autumn day that made even silence feel sacred. The maple trees surrounding St. Agnes boarding school in rural Vermont burned with shades of copper and fire, their leaves cascading like confetti in slow motion as the wind whispered through the campus. It was October 21st, a Friday, and the chapel bell had just chimed 6 times, echoing down the stone halls and over the cloistered garden. Students were gathering for evening prayers, their black shoes tapping against worn flagstone floors, their whispers blending with the rustle of leaves outside. But one voice was missing from the gentle hum of routine. Sister Miriam. She was the only teacher who still hand-wrote letters in blue ink, who kept lavender sachets in her desk drawers and played cello during evening meditation. She had a softness to her presence, like light filtered through stained glass. Quiet, but impossible to ignore that morning, she had led her usual literature class, her silver cross swinging gently as she moved between desks, quoting Emily Dickinson with a conviction that made even the most restless girl pause. She spoke of hope being a thing with feathers. No one imagined that by nightfall her name would vanish like chalk washed from a blackboard. Clara Winslow, 15, noticed first. She had stayed behind after class to ask about a poem she didn't quite understand, but the classroom was locked. Sister Miriam's room, room 203 in the south dormitory, was empty, the bed still made, the lamp off. By night, when her absence at Vespers was confirmed, the whispers began. "Maybe she's sick," someone said. "Maybe she had to go home," offered another. But Clara knew better. Sister Miriam never left without her black satchel, and it was still there, hanging on the coat hook outside the library. The next morning word reached the faculty. Father Aldridge, the school's headmaster, addressed the staff and students with the kind of detached efficiency he was known for. "Sister Miriam has been called away on urgent duties," he said. "Let us respect her privacy and pray for her safe journey." His eyes, however, never once lifted from the paper he read. That same afternoon, Clara overheard 2 teachers whispering in the faculty lounge, the door slightly ajar. "She left no note?" one asked. "None. Just gone." "Like smoke," the other replied. The words sat like ice in Clara's stomach. On Sunday, Clara called her mother during scheduled phone hours. "She's gone," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Her?" her mother asked, confused. "Sister Miriam. No one will talk about it." There was a pause. Her mother, who remembered meeting the nun during orientation, immediately promised to call the school. But when she did, the response left her rattled. The receptionist said with careful clarity, "But we have no record of any faculty member by that name. Perhaps you're confusing her with someone else." The line went dead before she could reply. 2 more parents called, then 5, then 7. All were told the same thing: no Sister Miriam ever worked at St. Agnes. One mother even drove 3 hours to confront the administration in person. She left visibly shaken, saying only, "They looked me straight in the eye and told me I imagined her." Her daughter transferred schools a week later. By November, all signs of Sister Miriam were gone. Her classroom had a new teacher, her name was scrubbed from the faculty directory, her mail slot in the office was repainted. Even the portrait photo taken for the school's annual magazine, once clearly featuring her in the front row, was replaced by a group shot between 2 nuns. But Clara kept remembering small things. The way Sister Miriam once slipped her a German 2 cats. But Clara kept remembering small things, the way Sister Miriam once slipped her a pressed rosette in a backward curry. How she lingered one day after class, staring out the window with a distant look, murmuring, "Truth has a way of catching up, even in silence." Clara began writing everything down, dates, smells, things Sister Miriam had said. She no longer believed this was a case of someone leaving quietly. She believed Sister Miriam had been erased. One late night, she crept into the school's archives, an off-limit room behind the old library, filled with dusty yearbooks and handwritten logs dating back to the 1900s. She lit a candle and began searching. Nothing, not one mention of Sister Miriam, not in rosters, not in course assignments, not in chapel schedules. But tucked between 2 pages of an old attendance ledger from 1997, she found a scrap of paper that made her breath hitch. It read in small, careful script, "They made me disappear, but the children remember. If even one does, I am not gone." Clara folded the note and placed it inside her boot. She no longer just suspected something was wrong. She knew. And that knowledge, quiet but burning, began to shape her every step forward. Clara hadn't returned to her childhood home in Essex for over a year. Life after St. Agnes had pulled her in many directions: college applications, part-time jobs, therapy appointments she rarely stayed for. Her mother's recent surgery gave her a reason to come home again, to take over the house for a few days, to sort through old boxes stacked high in the attic, filled with the remnants of the girl she used to be. She hadn't expected to feel so detached from her own things. A drawer full of notebooks, annotated copies of Bronte and Plath, even the lavender hand cream Sister Miriam once gave her, none of it felt real anymore. The world Clara lived in now moved too fast for memory, but in one dented cardboard box labeled "Winter Stuff," tucked beneath old scarves and a broken lamp, she found something that didn't belong: an envelope. Pale yellow. No stamp, no postmark, just her name, written in delicate cursive with a fountain pen she recognized instantly. Clara. She stared at it for a long moment, heart quickening. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the letter inside. It was dated November 1st, 2017, just 2 weeks after Sister Miriam vanished. The writing was unmistakable. "Dearest Clara," it began, "I pray this letter reaches you. There is little time and less clarity, but I must try. If they've told you I left willingly, know that is not the truth. I was taken from the school, not escorted. There are things I've seen, things I was never supposed to witness. And some I captured. I left behind something important. Hidden where no one speaks of anymore, the basement classroom, room B12. I wasn't allowed down there after 2009, but I had to go back. I had to keep the image." Clara's breath caught. She read the sentence again. The basement classroom, or so they claimed. She had never seen a staircase leading down, never heard any mention of a lower level. It was an old school, yes, full of peculiar rules and long-forgotten wings, but a sealed-off classroom? That didn't make sense. "I left it in the cabinet beneath the crucifix," the letter continued, "wrapped in blue cloth. You must show anyone until you understand what it is. It is dangerous in the wrong hands, but it is proof of what was done, of what they covered up." Clara sat back on the attic floor, the paper trembling in her hands. Dust floated in the air like ash. The silence around her grew thick, as if even the house held its breath. Room B12, an image hidden, something worth silencing. She stood slowly, gripping the letter, and walked downstairs. Her mind raced. Why was this in her family's attic? Had Sister Miriam come here, given it to her parents? Had they hidden it from her? She wanted to ask her mother, but with her still recovering and half asleep on pain medication, Clara decided against it, for now. Instead, she made a copy of the letter, scanning it carefully and saving it to a flash drive she kept on her keychain. Then she returned the original to the envelope and slid it into her journal, the same one she'd used in Miriam's poetry class. She didn't sleep that night. She lay awake, playing memories in reverse like a broken film reel. The final week before the disappearances, Sister Miriam had seemed tense, distracted. She had abruptly stopped assigning new texts, shifting instead to silent writing sessions. On her last day, she dismissed class 10 minutes early and asked Clara to stay back, but never got to explain why. "I might not be here next week," she had said, brushing a strand of gray hair behind her ear. "But if I'm not, don't believe the silence." Clara hadn't known what that meant until now. A week later, her name was erased, her belongings gone, and any mention of her forbidden. Now, almost 4 years later, Clara held the only surviving link to her memory. And the words were clear. Something had been hidden, something visual. The image I could not leave behind. It felt like a warning. or a map. Clara knew what she had to do. She would return to St. Agnes, this time not as a student, but as a researcher. The school occasionally allowed alum to visit under academic preacher. She could request access to the archives, pose as someone documenting the school's architecture history. It was a long shot, but it was a start. She spent the next day drafting an email to the school office, claiming she was working on a thesis about Gothic revivalism in New England's private institutions, and would like to photograph the chapel and historic classrooms. She kept the tone formal, polite, and included just enough technical jargon to sound legitimate. 3 days later, a reply came from a woman named Sister Adrienne. "Dear Ms. Winslow, we would be pleased to welcome you back to St. Agnes. Your request has been reviewed and approved under supervision. Kindly check in at the administration office by 10:00 a.m. Monday. Pax Christi." Claire reread the email 3 times, unsure whether to feel relieved or alarmed. Approved under supervision. What did that mean? Who would supervise? And more importantly, did they suspect her true intentions? She printed the letter from Miriam, folded it neatly, and tucked it into a lined notebook alongside a diagram she had drawn of where room B12 might be located if it existed. Based on old fire evacuation maps, one of which she had screen captured years ago, there was indeed a corridor that once extended beneath the east wing of the chapel. It was no longer accessible, but maybe, just maybe, it was still there, waiting. On Sunday night, Clara packed a small backpack with essentials: camera, flashlight, a change of clothes, and a copy of the letter. She printed the school's old architectural plan and highlighted the suspected access point. As she zipped the bag shut, her fingers lingered on the edges of the photo she had taken years ago with Sister Miriam, the one now kept in a drawer beneath her bed. It was the only remaining image, though it too had begun to feel unreal. The next morning, just as the sun lit the frost-dusted fields, Clara boarded the early train back to Vermont. Outside the window, the forests passed in blurred reds and oranges, but her thoughts stayed buried, deep below ground level, beneath the chapel and the classrooms, where secrets waited in the dark. The train arrived just after 9, and Clara stepped off onto the chilly platform, pulling her coat tighter around her. The Vermont air in early November had a sharpness that bit into her skin, but she welcomed it. The grounded her. The small town surrounding St. Agnes was still exactly as she remembered. A bakery that opened at dawn, a post office where gossip moved faster than mail, and that narrow road winding up to the ivy-clad gates of the school. As she approached the wrought iron entrance, her stomach clenched, not with fear, but anticipation. She had rehearsed her cover story meticulously concerned with Defiance journalist with an interest in Gothic revival architecture, currently working on a piece about historic religious institutions in New England. She carried a satchel filled with blank notepads, a digital camera, and printouts of old maps she claimed were sourced from public archives. Her application, as she had hoped, was just specific enough to seem legitimate, and just vague enough to avoid too many questions. Still, when she saw Sister Adrienne waiting for her near the chapel steps, she stiffened involuntarily. The nun was tall and stern-looking, her posture so upright it seemed like it had been carved from stone. "Miss Winslow," she said, extending a gloved hand, "welcome back to St. Agnes. It's rare to see an alumni return with such academic enthusiasm." Clara smiled politely, trying to keep her voice level. "Thank you, sister. It's strange and familiar at the same time. I never appreciated the architecture while I was a student, too distracted by homework and curfews, I suppose." Sister Adrienne's eyes didn't blink. "We're glad your perspective has matured. The school is still very much as you left it, though some parts are no longer open to guests. For safety reasons, of course." That was the first red flag. Clara kept walking beside her, heels clicking on the stone walkway, past the courtyard where students once whispered secrets, and into the administration building. After signing a visitor's log and receiving a guest pass, she was allowed to wander parts of the campus with escort upon request. She nodded obediently, hiding the fact that she had already memorized the path toward the east wing, where the fire escape map had once shown a downward stairwell now long sealed off. Her first stop was the library. Officially, she was there to ask about old blueprints and building permits. Unofficially, she was looking for any document that might confirm the existence of room B12. The librarian was new, a soft-spoken woman in her 30s who didn't recognize Clara. That helped. "I'm particularly interested in how the school expanded over the decades," Clara explained, flipping open a notebook. "Were there ever lower levels, like substructures or older foundations that got closed off?" The woman frowned thoughtfully. "I know some parts were decommissioned in the early 2000s, something about structural integrity. We don't keep students or staff in the lower East Wing anymore." "But it still exists?" Clara pressed gently. "Physically, I mean." The librarian hesitated, then nodded. "I suppose it does, technically, though I don't believe it's accessible. There used to be an old staircase near the chapel's boiler room that was sealed off on that himself." That was more than Clara had hoped for. She asked if she could look at any archived maps, and after some digging was led to a filing cabinet labeled Maintenance and Grounds. Inside were brittle copies of blueprints, some water-damaged, others frayed. She ran her finger down the spine of one labeled St. Agnes Renovation Plan, 1996. Her heart thudded when she saw it, a sub-level listed beneath the chapel. Room B10, B11, B12. There it was, listed plainly. No annotation, no disconnected note, just a rectangle marked B12 directly beneath the Eastern Prayer Room. The cabinet also contained a file labeled Restricted Areas, Site Plans, stamped confidential in faded red. She photographed everything. Later that evening, Clara returned to the guest room she had rented at a nearby inn and examined her findings under lamplight. The architectural plan matched her memory exactly, and according to the legend, the east stairwell hadn't been demolished, it had been sealed. That was a critical difference. It meant the room still existed, not erased, just buried. Back at the school the next morning, she requested to photograph parts of the East Wing. For composition purposes. Sister Adrienne raised an eyebrow, but allowed it, assigning a junior staff member named Thomas to accompany her. Thomas was affable, distracted, clearly more interested in his phone than the architecture. As they walked past the chapel and toward the eastern corridor, Clara casually asked about the building's renovations. "A bunch of it got closed off when I was a student," he replied. "I think a pipe burst or something. They never reopened it." "Do you know what's behind that sealed door?" she asked, stopping in front of a blank wall that had once been a stairwell entry. Thomas shrugged. "I think it used to be classrooms or storage. One of the older nuns said it was condemned. Kind of spooky, honestly." She took photos of the wall, not for the article she wasn't writing, but to study the material. She noted that the bricks used to block it were a slightly different shade than the surrounding ones. Not by much, but enough to suggest they had been added later. Her instinct screamed that the space beyond that wall had not been forgotten. It had been deliberately hidden. That night, Clara waited until lights dimmed across campus and most visitors had left. With a hood pulled low and soft-soled shoes, she slipped out of her room and returned to the east corridor. She carried a small flashlight, the printout of the blueprint folded in her coat pocket. She pressed her ear to the sealed wall and listened. Nothing. Just silence. But she didn't expect to hear anything. Not yet. She walked further down the hallway, tapping gently along the edges with the heel of her palm. Hollow. Solid. Solid. Hollow? Then, one tap rang different. She stopped. A section of the baseboard didn't sit flush with the floor. Bending down, she discovered a small metal latch hidden beneath flaking paint. Her pulse spiked. She eased it open. Dust spilled out, and behind it, a narrow crawlspace, dark, cold, and leading directly beneath the chapel. It was too tight to navigate without equipment. But she now had proof. The room was real. The basement existed. Someone had taken great care to make sure no one went down there, which meant something important had been left behind. The crawlspace was narrower than Clara anticipated, lined with damp stone and old wooden beams that creaked softly as she moved. Every footstep echoed through the tunnel like whispers returning from the past. She had brought gloves, a flashlight strapped to her wrist, and a small crowbar in case any panel refused to budge. The air was thick with mildew and something older, something sour, like paper that had been forgotten for too long. Her breath fogged the beam of light as she crawled forward on her elbows, counting seconds to keep calm. After nearly 6 minutes of silent movement, the tunnel opened into a small chamber, stone-lined, with a low ceiling and remnants of what had once been shelving, now partially collapsed. This wasn't a storage room. It felt older than the rest of the school, a transition space, a barrier. Clara pushed further, heart pounding, until she spotted it, a rusted iron door, cracked open just enough to reveal darkness beyond. She hesitated. Then she slid through. What greeted her was not the ruins of some forgotten utility room. It was a classroom. The architecture was unmistakable, the arrangement of the floor tiles, the blackboard nailed into the wall, even the presence of a long-abandoned teacher's desk. Her flashlight's glow revealed rows of child desks, their wooden surfaces warped from years of dampness and neglect. On the far wall, behind the podium, a crucifix still hung, though the figure of Christ was missing. Only the outline of nails and a faded stain remained where the statue once was. Clara's skin prickled. There was a silence here too complete to be natural. She moved slowly to the teacher's desk, the air thick and unmoving. The drawers stuck at first, then gave way with a groan. Inside were remnants of old lesson plans, yellowed flashcards, and beneath it all, something wrapped in dark blue cloth. Her heart seized. She reached for it with trembling fingers, unrolling the cloth to reveal an object she had not expected. A thin, cloth-bound album, hand-sewn at the edges, childlike in its size and materials. The cover had no title, just a simple embroidered pattern. Stars and a cross. She opened it slowly. The first page was crude, crayon on thick parchment. A child had drawn a classroom, their figures blocky and stiff. One stood at the front, a nun with a soft face and gray veil. Above her was a shaky caption written in pencil. "Sister says we're safe here." The next drawing chilled Clara to her bones. It showed the same classroom, but the children were all turned toward the back of the room, where a tall figure stood in the doorway. This one had no face, just a dark silhouette, almost scribbled into existence with a thick black crayon. "He watches from the hall," the caption read. The drawings grew darker as she turned the pages. In one, a child was hiding under a desk. In another, 3 children stood in a line, all with mouths drawn as small red ovals, their eyes large and hollow. The page after that showed a close-up, just the face of the faceless man. No features, no eyes, only a collar, a Roman collar. Clara's stomach turned. The faceless figure wore a priest's collar. The children's drawings weren't abstract, they were trying to say something. She continued turning pages, each one more disturbing than the last. In one, the nun, the one who resembled Miriam, was drawn holding the hand of a crying child, shielding them from the black figure standing behind a cracked door. The caption, barely legible in graphite, said, "Sister said don't talk. He'll know if we do." Clara clutched the album tighter, her fingers cold. Near the back of the album was a single page, thicker than the rest, and when she peeled it open, she found a drawing that made her stop breathing. It was different from the others, masterful and more detailed, a full scene. A classroom mid-lesson, children sitting at their desks, a nun, clearly Sister Miriam, standing by the chalkboard, and then, bursting through the door, 2 men. One was the faceless priest. The other, wearing what looked like dark robes or a uniform, was grabbing Sister Miriam by the arm. The drawing showed her reaching toward her collar, where her crucifix dangled askew. Her mouth was drawn open, as if shouting. The children were frozen in their seats. One child in the corner had a tear falling from a square-shaped eye. At the bottom of the page, in red crayon, were the words, "They took her away. She never screamed again." Claire stared at it, mind racing. This wasn't just art, it was documentation, memory, a message smuggled out by children too afraid to speak. She felt a wave of nausea and rage. Why had no one ever seen this? Or had someone seen it and chosen to bury it? She turned the final page. It was blank, except for one sentence, scrawled hastily in what looked like a child's trembling hand. But she cried when she said it. Clara backed away from the desk, her breath shallow. She had seen enough to know the truth. Whatever happened in this room had been horrific, and Sister Miriam had tried to protect the children. She wasn't just removed, she had been silenced. Her act of resistance, her refusal to stay quiet, was preserved here by those she tried to shield. And it had cost her everything. She sat down on the floor, the album clutched to her chest. Dust settled on her shoulders like ash. In the heavy silence of the forgotten classroom, Clara felt the full weight of what she had uncovered. These children had been trying to speak through color, through line, through silence. Their voices hadn't vanished, they had been buried. But now the soil was shifting. Now someone was listening. Clara didn't sleep the night she found the album. Even after leaving the basement through the crawl space and resealing the small hatch, her mind refused to quiet. The images wouldn't fade. The faceless man, the terrified children, and the red crayon confession seared into her memory. She knew this was no longer just her story. It belonged to someone else too. Someone who might still be living with the consequences of that silence. She sat in the dimly lit lobby of the bed and breakfast the next morning, combing through old school rosters and alumni forums on her laptop, cross-referencing years, matching names with vaguely remembered faces. And then she found her, Grace Holloway, class of 2018, the same year Clara graduated. A quiet girl, always pale, often missing from group photos. Her file had been marked early transfer, but Clara distinctly remembered Grace sitting 3 rows behind her in Sister Miriam's class. She had always drawn in the margins of her notebook, never raising her hand, eyes often distant. What stood out now was a discussion thread Clara stumbled across on a recovery forum. Grace's name appeared in a post under the username GhostGirl818, recounting nightmares about a nun who vanished and a chapel no one talked about. Clara's pulse quickened. It couldn't be coincidence. It took 3 days and a string of vague, carefully worded emails, but she finally received confirmation from a rehab center in Albany. Grace Holloway was there, in residential treatment for trauma-induced addiction. Clara arranged for a visitor's pass, unsure if Grace would even remember her, or worse, refused to speak. The facility was gray and unremarkable, tucked between a shuttered strip mall and a Lutheran church. The intake nurse led her down a hall that smelled faintly of antiseptic and lemon polish. "She has good days and bad," the nurse warned gently. "She agreed to see you. Just be patient, and if she asks you to stop, you stop." Clara nodded, clutching her bag. Grace sat curled on a vinyl chair in the common room, her hair cropped short, her sweater sleeves stretched over trembling fingers. She looked thinner than Claire remembered, her eyes deep-set, rimmed with shadows. Clara approached slowly. "Grace?" The girl looked up, blinked, and then tilted her head slightly. "I know you," she murmured. "You were in Sister Miriam's class." Clara nodded. "So were you." Grace's lips pressed together tightly, and her gaze dropped to the scuffed tile floor. "They said she left," Clara said carefully. "But that's not true, is it?" Grace didn't speak for a long moment. Then, almost imperceptibly, she shook her head. "She didn't leave. She was taken." Her voice was flat, mechanical. "After Vespers, that night, she told us to run if we ever saw him come into the classroom. But none of us did. We just froze, like we always." Clara knelt beside her. "Grace, I found the drawings. The ones in the basement. You made some of them, didn't you?" Grace's breath hitched. "All did. She said if we couldn't speak, we should draw, that pictures were safe, that maybe one day someone would see them and believe us." Clara gently pulled the cloth-wrapped album from her bag and laid it on the table. Grace flinched as if it were a live wire. "That's mine," she whispered. "That was our story." Her eyes welled with tears, and she gripped the edges of her chair. "Said she was mentally unstable. They said she broke school policy, but she wasn't. She was the only one who stayed after dark, the only one who didn't pretend everything was normal." Clara opened to the page with the faceless priest. Grace looked away immediately. "He was real," she said. "He came in through the side door, the one behind the sacristy. The lights would flicker, and then we'd hear the key in the lock." Claire's voice caught in her throat. "Do you remember what happened that last night?" Grace nodded slowly. "There was a mass, a special one, closed chapel, no students invited. But she stayed after class. I saw her from the dorm window. She wasn't supposed to be there." She paused. "Later that night we heard shouting, and the next day she was gone. Father Aldridge said she'd transferred, But her cross, her silver cross, it was still on the podium. I know, because I snuck down after midnight. It was lying sideways, like someone had tried to pull it from her neck. Clara reached across the table. Grace, do you know what they were trying to cover up? Grace wiped at her face, eyes unfocused. It wasn't just her. It was before her, too. Other kids? We used to see them in the infirmary. Girls who cried in their sleep, who wouldn't talk. One girl disappeared in my second year. They said she was homesick and left, but her suitcase was still under her bed. Her voice broke. We were told it was sin to question. That silence was godly. But Sister Miriam said silence could be cruel. She said light belonged in the open. Clara sat with her in silence, letting the truth settle. These weren't isolated incidents. This was systemic, ritualized. Claire had started this journey to uncover what happened to one woman. Now she realized the story stretched further, reaching into the bones of the school itself. But there was still something missing. A link, a name, a face behind the faceless figure. Do you remember what he looked like? Clara asked quietly. Grace closed her eyes. I remember his hands, she whispered. Rings, one with a red stone, like blood. She hesitated, and a scar across his palm. He used to rub it when he was angry. Clara's stomach sank. That wasn't a symbol. That was a wound. A permanent marker, something someone could still carry. She flipped back to the drawing in the album, the one with the man dragging Sister Miriam out the door. She hadn't noticed it before, but now, as Grace watched her, she saw it clearly. The man's hand was outstretched, and on it a faint red line had been drawn across the palm. Not an accident. A detail. A clue. Claire looked back at Grace. Do you remember his name? Grace's lips moved, but no sound came. She seemed to struggle, then whispered so quietly Clara had to lean in. He wasn't on the staff list. He didn't wear a name tag, but Sister called him the Patron. She said he was from the order, that he had power over the school. Claire sat back slowly, mind reeling. The order. That word again. It hadn't meant anything before, but now it echoed. The revelation of the patron and the scarred hand haunted Clara for days. She returned to her apartment in Burlington, but barely unpacked. Her mind reeled with Grace's voice, the faceless drawings, the cries buried in crayon. Clara knew the order Grace mentioned wasn't metaphorical. It was real, perhaps institutional, and powerful enough to operate beneath the surface of a respected religious school. But to push the truth further into light, she needed more than memory and sketches. She needed something indisputable, something that couldn't be dismissed as subjective trauma or adolescent imagination. And then, unexpectedly, help came from within St. Agnes itself. It started with a message from an unrecognized email address. Hi, I'm Margaret Levin, English Department faculty at St. Agnes. I found something in the archive room that I think belongs to your investigation. Please be discreet. I don't trust everyone here. Clara's chest tightened. She replied instantly, arranging to meet Margaret at a coffee shop just outside campus grounds. The woman who arrived wore the stiffness of someone who spent her life in old buildings and stricter institution. Her scarf was pulled high, and her gloved hands trembled as she removed a small cassette tape from her tote bag. I'm not sure how it got missed, she said softly. It was wedged behind a row of chapel sermons from the late 90s. No label, just a number. But I listened. And Clara... It's her. Clara leaned forward. Miriam? Margaret nodded slowly, her voice pleading. It's not a sermon. It's something else. They played the tape in Clara's old stereo system later that night. The room went cold the moment it clicked into place. At first there was only static. Then the sound of shuffling, a faint crackle, as though the recording device had been turned on mid-movement. Then a voice, female, breathless, urgent. This is Sister Miriam. I don't know how much time I have. If you find this, please don't ignore it. They're using the chapel. At night. The order, the patron, he said it was about discipline, about saving them. But that's not what this is. Her voice broke on the last word. There was a pause, then the sound of a door creaking, followed by muffled footsteps. No, you can't take them again. Please, just stop. Listen to me, what you're doing is not sanctified. It's evil. It's cruelty cloaked in prayer." There was a loud thud, something fell, papers fluttered, a breath caught in the microphone. Then another voice, male, cold. "You were warned, sister." Miriam's voice rose again, raw with terror. "I will go to the bishop. I will speak their name." The sound that followed was so sharp and sudden that Clara jumped. A high-pitched child's scream, distant but piercing. Then a crash, like a chair being overturned, and the tape cut off. Silence filled the room. Clara sat frozen, hand over her mouth. Margaret's eyes were glassy. "She was trying to document it," Margaret whispered. "She thought the tape would be enough. She tried to fight it." Clara rewound the tape, listening again, and this time noting the subtle details. The door creak was followed by 2 sets of footsteps. The man's voice, measured but undeniably threatening, matched Grace's description, flat, authoritative, familiar only in its coldness, and the child's scream. It wasn't staged. It was pure, instinctive terror. A child in pain. A witness. Claire stared at the stereo. This was no longer a theory. It was a historical record, a cry across time. She burned the recording onto a flash drive and stored the tape in a safe deposit box downtown. Then she wrote to Margaret, "If there's anything else, any record, any name, please share it with me. This can't be buried again." The reply came hours later. "I remember a name from a chapel roster in 2016, a guest who signed as Brother Caleb Wren. He wasn't staff, but he had access to restricted wings. He always wore gloves." Clara's pulse raced. A name. Finally. She searched online. Caleb Wren yielded nothing concrete. A few obscure mentions in old diocesan newsletters, a blurry photograph from a retreat in 2014, and a notation in an order officiating program, Vermont chapter. Clara dug deeper. The Order of St. Vicentius, a cloistered independent order with a long history of operating adjacent to larger church structures. No formal jurisdiction, no transparency. She requested tax records, property leases, anything tying them to St. Agnes, but everything seemed curated, intentionally vague. Later that week, Margaret contacted her again, shaken. "Clara, I think someone's watching me. The archive door was ajar this morning. My desk was rifled through. I didn't report it." Clara didn't tell her about the email she had received just hours earlier from an anonymous address. "Stop digging. This isn't your history." It wasn't signed, no traceable IP, just those 7 words, but Clara knew the tone. It matched the voice on the tape, the voice that said, "You were warned." Clara stood at the foot of the chapel steps, with the morning light slicing through stained glass windows like fractured confessions. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she waited for the woman she once feared as much as respected, Mother Superior Therese. The head of the convent had summoned Clara after word of her presence reached the administrative offices. It was no surprise. Clara had been too visible, too persistent, and now, after the cassette tape, after the drawings, after Grace and Margaret, she was no longer investigating in the shadows. She was making waves. The door to the cloistered side wing creaked open. A nun led Clara through cold stone corridors lined with framed photographs of deceased sisters and graduates, their smiles frozen in time. At the end of the hallway was a heavy oak door, and behind it, a room more austere than sacred. Mother Therese sat in a high-backed chair, her veil pristine, her hands folded like alabaster relics on the desk before her. She didn't look up right away. When she did, her gaze was hard, her expression unreadable. "Ms. Winslow," she said, voice clipped, "I understand you've been making inquiries. Stirring memories better left untouched." Claire sat without being invited, her jaw set. "I'm not here to stir memories. I'm here for truth. Sister Miriam didn't just disappear. She tried to expose something, and you know it." The Mother Superior's lips tightened. "You are not the first student to become overly imaginative about her time here. But Sister Miriam had difficulties. She was asked to step down." "That is all." Clara leaned forward. "I've heard her voice, on a tape, begging someone to stop. I've seen drawings from students, horrific drawings of abuse. You can't keep pretending this didn't happen." The old woman's eyes flickered. For a moment Clara thought she saw something soften. Regret or calculation? Then came the sentence that dropped like cold steel between them. "We chose to forget," Mother Therese said quietly. "To protect the sanctity of the house of God. Sometimes silence is mercy." Clara's breath caught. "Mercy for who?" she snapped. "Certainly not for the children. Not for Miriam. You let it happen. You let them silence her." She threatened to involve the press? The diocese? It would have destroyed us. Her voice was still calm, but there was a tremor beneath it, like something ancient straining behind a dam. "We did what we had to do. The world is cruel to fallen orders." Clara stood, disgusted. "You protected the institution, not God, and certainly not his children." She turned to leave, but before she reached the door, Mother Teresa spoke again, this time barely above a whisper. "I loved her too, you know." Clara froze. The words came so unexpectedly that for a second she didn't understand them. "Miriam," the Mother Superior continued, still not meeting her eyes. "She was brave, too brave." Clara didn't respond. She opened the door and left, her skin crawling with the weight of half-confessions and concealed grief. Outside the chapel, the wind had picked up, scattering brittle leaves across the cloister walk. Clara stepped into the courtyard, head down, heart heavy. And then a hand caught her wrist. It belonged to an elderly nun, stooped, gray-eyed, and almost invisible in her faded habit. "Miss Winslow," the woman said softly, glancing over her shoulder. "Come, quickly." Clara followed her without speaking, instinct guiding her more than logic. They ducked into a side garden, where the wall blocked most of the view from the main building. The nun's hands were shaking as she reached into her sleeve and pulled out a small object wrapped in linen. She held it out. "She told me to keep this. She said, if one day someone asks the right questions, give this to them. And tell them about the house." Clara unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a rosary, silver and old, its chain broken in two. The cross had a name etched faintly on the back, Miriam. Clara looked up. "What house?" The nun lowered her voice. "Her family's house, in East Calais. Old stone cottage, barely standing now. She said she hid something there, something she couldn't leave on school grounds." Clara's mind raced. "Why are you helping me?" The woman's eyes welled. "Because I remember the children. I remember their silence, and I remember the night they dragged her from her classroom. I was too afraid then. But now—" She pressed Clara's hand. "Go, before they come looking for you." Claire returned to her car in a daze. The rosary felt like a key. East Calais was less than 2 hours away, a forgotten dot on the map surrounded by forests and winding roads. She didn't stop to think. She drove immediately, the rosary glinting in the sun on her dashboard. The further she went from the school, the lighter her chest felt, as if proximity to its walls compressed the lungs and dulled the soul. She arrived at the edge of East Calais by dusk. The cottage wasn't hard to find. It stood alone off a gravel road, its porch caved inward, and ivy swallowing half the road. But the foundation held, and the front door, though weather-worn, opened with a reluctant groan. Inside was dust, cold air, and the scent of wood long untouched. Clara's flashlight swept across cracked floorboards, broken furniture, and shelves lined with forgotten books. She moved through the rooms like a diver searching a sunken ship. In the back room, what might have once been a study, she found a small desk, its drawers swollen shut from years of moisture. She pried one open. Papers, old photographs, a letter addressed to no one. And beneath it all, a small wooden box with a faded emblem on its lid. The emblem looked familiar, an inverted triangle enclosed in a circle. Clara's fingers paused above it. Her breath was shallow. The air felt denser now, as if even the dust knew what lay inside. She opened the box. The wooden box in Sister Miriam's abandoned cottage was empty. No documents, no letters, no hidden flash drive tucked beneath a false bottom, just dust and the echo of something removed long ago. But it wasn't disappointment Clara felt. It was confirmation. Someone had been here before her, someone who knew what Miriam had hidden. That, in itself, was proof of its importance. Clara searched the rest of the study, scanning shelves, tapping panels, checking behind faded portraits and beneath loose tiles, until finally her flashlight caught something unusual in the corner of the room, a section of plaster near the floor with uneven strokes. She knelt, brushing away decades of grime, revealing what had been scratched directly into the wall. 3 words, carved with such pressure the letters had cracked the surface. "I failed them. Forgive me." Clara's throat tightened. The message was raw, desperate, personal, not for the world, just for the world's. It wasn't for show. It was confession. Miriam had lived here, and in those final days carried the weight of every child she couldn't protect. Clara stood slowly, heart heavy, scanning the room again. A shadow stretched beneath a nearby armoire, a narrow seam between it and the floor that seemed deeper than it should be. When she pulled it away from the wall, dust poured out in sheets, and behind it, hidden by darkness, was a door handle barely visible at knee-height. She crouched, tried it. But the wood was rotting, and with enough pressure, the hinges creaked. She braced herself, pushed harder, and it finally gave. Cold air spilled out, along with the distinct scent of soil and rust. She aimed her flashlight down. A narrow staircase carved from stone and damp with condensation led into a basement she hadn't seen on the house's blueprint. Every instinct screamed caution, but she descended. The basement was small, no more than 10 feet across, with shelves crumbling along the walls and cardboard boxes sagging from moisture. At the far end, beneath a shroud of black plastic tarp, something large rested, square, metal, reinforced, a suitcase. Clara stepped closer, peeled the tarp away, and saw that the case was locked with a rusted latch that snapped easily under pressure. The lid creaked as she lifted it. Inside were rows of manila folders, labeled in a spidery, familiar hand. Names she recognized instantly. First, Holloway Grace, then Bennett Alicia, Martina, Jonah, Rivers, Ellie, student after student, all of whom had been in Sister Miriam's final class. Claire reached for one. It was Grace's. The contents weren't assignments or disciplinary records. They were medical files. Psych reports, session logs, notations from school psychologists, some marked confidential, others with scribbled margins, in Sister Miriam's handwriting. Claire read, "Concurring nightmares, requests for transfer denied." She opened another, Alicia Bennett. "Sudden withdrawal from peers, hospitalized after ingesting pills. Parents informed but declined further psychiatric intervention. Faculty concerned over influence of external adult." Clara's stomach turned. Another, Jonah Martinez. Expresses fear of clergy presence. Mentions the dark man watching from hall. Self-inflicted bruising on arms. Claims Sister Miriam warned him to stay away from chapel after dusk. Each file revealed not only the suffering of a child, but a pattern, trauma repeating itself across names, months, years. And throughout them, a constant, Sister Miriam, documenting what no one else would. She hadn't just been a teacher, she had been a witness, a record keeper, someone who saw the signs and refused to call it coincidence. Clara ran her fingers along the inner lining of the suitcase. A flap folded at the bottom revealed a small bundle of audio cassettes, unlabeled, numbered in sequence, 1 through 5. She pocketed them carefully, unsure of what they contained, but certain they were important. As she stood, something else caught her eye. A photograph. It had slipped from the last folder, creased and grainy. 5 students in uniform standing shoulder to shoulder. Sister Miriam behind them, hands on their shoulders, her smile tired but warm. Claire recognized Grace. She recognized Alicia. But the 5th child, on the far left, had been scribbled out viciously. Black ink obliterating the face, but not the hand. And on that hand was a ring with a red stone, oval, set deep. Clara's breath left her. She turned the photo over. On the back was a note, faint and hurried. "If anything happens to me, they will erase the records. This is not just about faith, it's about power. This house holds what the school cannot. Don't let them bury it again." Clara pressed the photo against her chest. This wasn't just a vault. It was a rescue attempt. Miriam had tried to preserve what she knew they'd destroy. And they almost succeeded. But now the evidence lived again in Clara's hands. As she made her way back up the stairs, she paused halfway, hearing the wind howl through the broken beams of the house above. It didn't feel empty anymore. It felt protective, as if Miriam still lingered, still guiding, still urging her forward. But Clara knew this was no longer just a story about the past. The patterns hadn't stopped. The children in those files had left St. Agnes, but the system, the rot, still breathed within the walls. And if the man in the photo still lived— The rain came suddenly as Clara drove back from East Calais, sheets of cold water slapping against the windshield like the sky itself was angry, grieving, or both. The suitcase with Miriam's files was locked in the trunk, and her fingers still tingled from handling its contents. The photograph of the 5 students, the ring, the blackout face, sat folded in the passenger seat. She hadn't stopped thinking about that ring, that detail confirmed by Grace, etched into drawings by children who couldn't bear to speak. It wasn't metaphor anymore, it was a mark, and someone had borne it inside the school's walls for years. Her phone buzzed just as she turned onto the highway. A message from Margaret Levin. "Come, now. I found something in the archives. It's about Miriam." Clara didn't hesitate. She rerouted back toward St. Agnes, rain be damned. By the time she arrived, the skies had darkened to near dusk. Margaret was waiting near the east gate, her umbrella trembling in the wind, face pale beneath her glasses. "I had to use the spare key," she said breathlessly, "to the restricted file room. What I found, it wasn't just hidden, it was intentionally mislabeled." Clara followed her inside, heart thudding. They passed silently through the library and into the back archives, where Margaret reached behind a false panel in the shelving and retrieved a slim leather-bound binder. "It's her death certificate," she said, "filed under diacertificate and sabbaticals. Look at the date." Clara opened the file, her breath catching as she read the details. Miriam Callahan, deceased October 17, 2018. Cause of death, vehicular accident. Location, Rural Route 32, Vermont. Clara's eyes widened. That's the night she disappeared, the night after the chapel closed, the night Grace said she saw her dragged away. She flipped to the next page, a police report sparse and vague, no photographs, no witness statement, just a note, body burned beyond recognition, confirmed via personal effects. Clara's hand clenched. "That's not how accidents are reported. There should have been an investigation." Margaret nodded grimly. "There wasn't one. No autopsy, no toxicology, just a formality. Like they needed her gone, officially." Clara stared at the signature on the report. Father Caleb Wren, listed as the reporting party. Her stomach turned. He filed the report? Margaret pulled out another sheet, an internal memo from the diocese. It referenced a disciplinary review for Sister Miriam, dated 2 weeks before her disappearances. The language was vague, but damning authored inquiries into private student files and inappropriate contact with external press. Clara looked at the note scrawled in the margin. Intervention scheduled post-liturgical observance. Immediate action required to preserve sanctity. She whispered it aloud. Immediate action. That wasn't protocol. That was a warning. Margaret reached into her coat and handed Clara a thin audio recorder. "I copied one of the tapes you found in the suitcase. Number 3. Listen." Clara pressed play. At first it was quiet. Then Sister Miriam's voice emerged shaky, recorded low. "They say I'm disobedient, that I'm dangerous. But I see the bruises." A silence. "I hear the confessions. The children are not safe." A pause. A sigh. Then, "I told the order. I begged them to intervene. They told me it would destroy the sanctity of the church, that some things are too sacred to expose. But God does not hide darkness. He brings it to light." The tape crackled. "If I disappeared, know it wasn't an accident. Know that I tried." Clara hit stop, her chest heaving. The weight of it was unbearable. Sister Miriam knew she was walking into her own erasure, and the order, whoever they were, had let it happen. Or worse, orchestrated it. Clara gathered every document, every tape, every image. She laid them out across the reading table, the children's drawings, the faceless priest, the tape with the scream, the photograph with the red-stoned ring. The pattern was undeniable. Miriam had uncovered a ring of abuse, had fought to document it, and when she refused to be silenced, they made her disappear. Then they fabricated a narrative. Unstable nun, car accident, nothing to see. But the pieces didn't lie. The evidence was there. The only thing missing now was confrontation. Margaret leaned in. "There's one more thing. Someone erased most of them from that night, but I found a backup in a maintenance ledger. Brother Caleb Wren signed in. At 6:12 p.m., no sign-out time. Because he didn't leave the chapel that night, not before Miriam disappeared. The room fell silent again. Outside, thunder rolled, shaking the old stained glass. And somewhere in that storm, Clara felt it, a shift. As if the walls that once swallowed secrets had begun to spit them out. The press release went out at dawn, with Clara pacing in front of her apartment window as the email finished uploading to the encrypted drive. She had sent everything, to major outlets, independent watch journalists, survivor advocacy groups, every drawing, every file, every minute of tape. Her message was short and clear. You asked for proof. This is what was buried beneath St. Agnes. She hadn't signed her name at first, then changed her mind. Some stories deserved a name attached. Within hours, her inbox was flooded. The first article broke by lunchtime. A local journalist from Burlington who had interviewed her once for a piece on small-town faith scandals had taken the lead. Then came national interest. CNN, NPR, The Atlantic. They used Miriam's photo from the classroom, her gentle eyes hovering above headlines like a ghost, reclaiming her voice. Clara watched the world react in real time. She didn't leave her apartment for 2 days. By the third, the Bishop of Vermont held a press conference. There were phrases like deep regret, unfortunate oversight, verbal advance scaring pending. Clara recognized the damage control, the sanitized grief of institutions forced into light. But the world didn't buy it this time. People wanted names. People wanted justice. Former students began coming forward, quietly at first, then in numbers. Grace was interviewed by a survivor advocate on national television, her voice shaking as she said, "She tried to save us, but no one saved her." That clip alone went viral. Clara watched with tears in her eyes. By the end of the week, the Diocese of New England suspended all operations at St. Agnes. The Order of St. Vicentius issued a single-page statement disavowing Brother Caleb Wren, who had not been seen or heard from since the story broke. Clara handed his photo and the ring detail to authorities. Investigators found no recent address, no credit activity. He had vanished. Or perhaps, like Miriam, he had been made to disappear by the very institution that once protected him. Only this time, it wasn't being buried, it was being exhumed. Margaret resigned from her post, citing health reasons, but privately sent Clara a handwritten note. "You did what we couldn't." She's not alone anymore. In the weeks that followed, Clara testified before a joint committee investigating abuse within religious schools. Her voice didn't tremble. She spoke Miriam's name 5 times during that hearing. Each time, it landed like a strike of thunder. Her photo appeared on a wall of honor displayed by survivors of institutional trauma, framed in black, a single rose beneath. She left echoes. Months passed. Clara returned to freelance journalism, but nothing felt quite the same. She declined offers for book deals and speaking tours. It wasn't her story. It had always been Miriam's. Still, she stayed in touch with Grace, who now lived in a transitional housing program in Maine and painted with children who'd experienced similar trauma. "It's strange," Grace said once. "Now that she's remembered, I don't have the nightmares so much." Clara smiled through the phone. "Maybe she's resting." One warm spring afternoon, nearly a year after the article broke, Clara returned to St. Agnes, not as an investigator, not as a threat, but as someone paying respect. The grounds were silent, the building shuttered, waiting for its future to be decided. But the courtyard remained open. She walked slowly through it, the air soft with pollen, the wind curling through the stone arches like a hymn. And that's when she saw it. A bench, new, stone, clean, tucked beneath the old oak tree where Miriam used to walk between classes. She approached, heart hammering. The inscription was simple, carved into the backrest in a font she recognized from old hymnals. "Sister Miriam, you saw, you tried, we remember." Clara sank onto the bench slowly, hands folded in her lap. The sky above was bright, the tree swayed gently, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she breathed. Not the breath of running or hiding or chasing, but the breath of something finished, something heard. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps us bring more real, haunting narratives to light. Which part of Sister Miriam's story hit you the hardest? And where in the world are you watching from? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every one.